Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jen. I'm one of the co-founders of Saga, and over the last few weeks, we've been having these. I don't know what this is. Is like a podcast, or is it like I don't know what it is, but we've been hosting some of these information sessions, so folks can learn a little bit more about kind of what we are trying to build as a team, and kind of base it on what's going on kind of in the crypto space in the long run, and then uh, uh, and in the general landscape as well. And so over time, I think the idea is, right when we launched, there was a whole influx of new folks coming in who didn't really know what Saga is about, but they just heard the kind of various things that we are doing, and so we thought it would be nice to summarize some of the kind of innovations that are happening within Saga and the team that's building it. And so we've been hosting these little sessions, and this is our third one.
Yeah, we have a lot of, I think, like our high gainer descriptions for Saga. Sometimes, I don't want to say they go over people's heads, but when you hear like an L1 to launch L1s, it kind of just begs a deeper explanation. So we've been using what we're calling Stack Exploder. In the past, these have just been our blog posts that kind of double click dive into some of the tech aspects of what we're building. But I think that bringing them out into a place where anybody who's sitting on Twitter Spaces can listen in is great. And, if you missed previous sessions as well, I just want to throw this out here that you can go to our YouTube account, which is linked on our website, and you can catch up. We've turned all of these sessions into, I guess, podcast format's probably the best way to describe it, Jin. We've cut out all the excess conversation and just left in there kind of the meat of what we've been going over. In our first episode, we talked a lot about the origin of Saga and some of how essentially blockchains today came about and how Saga fits within this greater context of decentralized platforms. And then in last week's episode, we focused a little bit more on the idea of tokenomic design, especially diving into the idea of scarce systems, which almost all decentralized protocols and platforms are built around the idea of a scarcity model. And if you stayed with us throughout that entire session last week, you probably know that towards the end, we really started diving into how we are planning to build a system that scales more efficiently than we believe any other protocol that exists today. I think that one of the core theses that we have is, I'm calling them light bulb moments, but I feel like that's maybe like a little bit too egotistical. But there are these things that we need to consider, which one thing I think we'll probably revisit is the way decentralized protocols are typically built. The larger they grow, the more cracks are shown. We see this in large protocols today that are starting to suffer congestion. We see this through super high and volatile gas prices. And we talked a bit about last session about why these systems are so very different than what we see in the traditional tech space, and how in the traditional building space in tech and startup world, many of these like baseline aspects of how you build a platform have become commoditized. Yet in the blockchain space and the decentralized space, we still deal with massive volatility, with the kind of always imminent pressure of scarcity. And we really kind of got into why Saga is set up to be antithetical to this idea that as something grows, the pressure is applied more and more heavily to the end user. So maybe that's a good spot for you to pick up, Jin, is just kind of revisit the kind of final thesis from last week, and we can kind of use that to segue into kind of more discussion on tokenomics, because this week we want to talk a bit, I believe, more about our kind of like two-tier token design, and also like obviously how builders can benefit from the way that we've set up Saga.
Yeah. Thanks for that intro. So let's just begin. You just dive straight into Saga. In the last 2 weeks, we've done a lot of like long history lessons, but I think it'll be beneficial to just dive in and describe kind of what Saga's kind of token economic design is. And Micah, you just mentioned that it's a two-tier token structure, which is a little bit unusual. Um, the idea here is that with Saga, we are trying to completely isolate the token flows that are related to infrastructure costs and token flows related to services that the product or the project offers to the end users. And so that once you kind of have those two separated out, then you can kind of start designing economic flows that are more similar to how things exist in the real world today. And by proxy, by being able to split this up into two, you allow yourself to design a system in which you're not worried about scarcity of the actual infrastructure, but more in the kind of abundant mindset that we talked about last week. And we encourage you to go and listen to the last episode if you wanted to learn a little bit more about how to avoid the scarcity effect of designing token economic designs. And before I start, I wanted to also mention, I think over time, folks who come in have shared with us, hey, like, can you make this like these sessions as easy as possible to understand? And that's kind of the intention. I've realized essentially over time that I've been kind of building in this space, and I just counted this last year. It's almost 6 years since I've been kind of building different economic systems and products within the blockchain ecosystem. And so, in the beginning, when I joined, it was these things were quite complicated as well. And so I know I didn't come in as like like a decentralized maxi or a system engineer or something like that. And so um, trying to kind of distill these concepts down into something simpler so people can understand is kind of the purpose of this session. But sometimes, obviously, things get a little bit deeper, and so let us know in comments and things like that if our content is a little too complicated or needs more explanation, and we'll kind of adjust that course going forward. So we described a two-tiered token structure. Let's quickly let's do the usual thing here, which is going back into history of how economic systems work in general products, right? So today, the good news is we're not going to talk about crypto as much. Let's just talk about general economic systems in products that people use every day. And I fail to kind of choose an example usually of something that everyone commonly knows about. What is pretty universal actually is Netflix a good example? Does everybody know what Netflix is, or is this like a very US centric way of thinking about things?
I think Netflix is a good one.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's ubiquitous enough. They're definitely international.
Yeah, Netflix or your favorite streaming service. Let's call it that. So I'll just shorten that to Netflix.
Yeah,
But
there you go.
going forward, if everyone can replace Netflix with or your famous favorite, actually YouTube is probably a good example too. So if you think about it, every economic system out there has this two-tier structure that we talked about, right? So let me talk about, like, as an end user, I subscribe to Netflix. I pay a subscription fee to Netflix, right? And do I know if Netflix is running on AWS or other cloud services, or if they have their own data center? Like, do I know anything about how their infrastructure works? Not really. I don't really care. Nor does Netflix kind of make that front and center, right? So I pay, I forget how much it is. It's like $10-15 a month to Netflix, and that's it, right? There's no other interaction flows that happen. In the background, Netflix is obviously hosting their, let's call it application, right? So the video streaming application, the backend is hosted in some infrastructure. It can be a data center of their own. I believe they do use Amazon Web Services, so they use the servers that are provisioned by Amazon and host things in the background, right? And how does the payment flow happen from Netflix to Amazon? Is a direct relationship between the two, right? So Netflix, probably month by month. I don't know what the period is, but they pay, large sums of money essentially from to AWS for giving infrastructure to host their application. So, how does the economic flow work? Right, it's the revenue is derived from the end users, me, who's paying subscriptions to Netflix, and then Netflix takes some of that money and pays AWS for the infrastructure. And there's this kind of like two-tier structure, because on one side is the revenue side and it's the customer side, and the other side is an expense side and it's the infrastructure side. And there's no crossover between the two, and it's Netflix's job to manage like their revenue versus their cost to make sure that whatever services they're offering is competitive in terms of pricing, and that they're making money, right? And what's the kind of like the benefit of this, right? So the benefit is over time, Netflix can decide to choose to move their kind of services from one place to another based on competition, right? So this actually did happen back in the I would say about 10, 20 years ago. In the very beginning, Netflix began by hosting their own data center. So they built their own data centers in different geographies. Because like when Netflix started, cloud didn't exist. And so the answer was either they hosted it on some other web servers like data center somewhere, or they built their own. And really in the early days, they spent millions of dollars building out data center infrastructure over time. And over time, essentially what they have figured out was that Amazon Web Services and these cloud providers does a better job of offering infrastructure solution. And so they figured out that it is not only more cost effective, but it is also more has more features, can reach more people, scale quicker by converting their data center into AWS. So they went through like this transition period where they offloaded from their own data centers and moved it up into Amazon Web Services and cloud-based models, right? And they have like whole blog posts talking about this over time where they made this announcement. And that's the benefit of this, right? So by bifurcating the two, you can essentially design essentially a system where you're dealing with your customers directly, aka your subscribers. You get the money from them, and your relationship is directly with that customer ultimately. And then on the other side, you have the infrastructure cost. It's a cost center, and you can change that over time, and you can have an economic relationship that's direct between the infrastructure and yourself. And there's really no crossover in the middle. And this works if you take a look at almost every single service provider out there that you use today. This is the case, right? So I talked about YouTube. YouTube is the same way. You talk about Uber or like Grab or Didi or whatever, like these ride sharing applications. It's the same thing, right? When you book a ride with these folks, you're working directly with these platforms and you're paying them directly, and they deal with the infrastructure and the cost, and they kind of hide it in the background. And this is how you make user experiences much better as well. But now let's go back to blockchain now, right? The blockchain situation today is like a little funky. So what a lot of blockchain products do, I would say, I guess they're not really products. I wouldn't call them products. These blockchain applications, what they do is they kind of offload the infrastructure and supplier costs directly back to the end users. And so when let's say I'm building a Netflix equivalent on Web3, what ends up happening is imagine like the equivalent situation would be if when I want to subscribe to Netflix, what Netflix tells you is, oh, you got to go and buy some Amazon credit and pay for the streaming of data from the Amazon servers back to you, right? And you can already imagine why this is kind of a disgusting proposition, because maybe Netflix uses Amazon and they use Cloudflare for certain things, and they have like 12 different vendors, for example. the way that economic flows currently work in blockchain is if you have 12 different service providers that are that your app is built on, then go and buy 12 different service providers tokens and pay for them separately is kind of the model that blockchain has used. And no wonder there are like usability issues with people trying to adopt blockchain, because as a user, why would I want to understand how the product and the application infrastructure functions and figure out how to actually pay for them myself? It doesn't make any sense ultimately, right? And so just like how the real world really has evolved over time to separate out the economic flow between customers, and that's what we call the front end token economic system, and the back end economic system, which is the infrastructure. Saga kind of mimics this essentially and makes it so that the economic flow is cut off between those two, and that's what we call the two-tier economic structure. So I'm going to pause really quickly. Maybe usually I tend to ramble on, and then the host tends to kind of button this up in a much nicer way.
I don't think that I have like I don't know if I have any sort of like nice button to put on. I think it makes sense. I mean, those of us. I'm not on engineering, and I don't typically build these systems, but I've interacted enough with internet applications throughout my entire life to realize that, like, yeah, hey, there's a pretty big divide here. I go to any other website in the world and either use their service completely for free, and that's great because it's not giving me that much value, or maybe they're taking my data and using it for advertising, and that's like one model out there. Or yeah, I'm paying for a subscription, or paying for. I'm going to use YouTube TV as an example because I just signed up for that. And obviously I'm paying it straight to YouTube, but I'm not really thinking at all about basically like what bills YouTube has to pay. I just assume that they bake that into kind of the front end fee that they're giving to me, and they obviously, hopefully they're able to sustain themselves as a business. But every internet, every like digital application user in the world thinks about experiencing apps and internet usage through that model. Either it is free to me and I don't think about anything, and I use it for value or resources or entertainment, or if it's super high value, or if it's getting something that is giving me access, then I paid the actual like application developer a flat fee or a recurring fee to get access to that. I never think about all of the little pieces of their stack. I don't really think about how much they're paying their UX designer. I definitely don't think about how much they're paying, to AWS on a monthly basis. And I really shouldn't have to be considered that. So I do think that for, we all had to kind of jump over this hurdle when we first entered the world of blockchain, and had to basically kind of get confronted with the fact that, the way that this entire industry is kind of set up is that basically any user costs get pushed directly to me through the application that I'm using, even if it's just infrastructure costs that they have. And I think that this idea that we are flipping that model, I'll just be honest, like I don't think that we get the credit for it, and maybe that's like part of what we need to explain from the tokenomics of how we've built Saga. But this idea, I really do want to make sure is ingrained in everybody's head that the users of an application that's being built on Saga, they're not going to go through that same system. Like we stand in pretty direct opposition to the way that 90% of the rest of this entire industry is kind of set up today. And how we got there, I think, is the big question mark. How are we able to abstract those costs away? It feels like the kind of the natural next question, I guess, to me, Jin. But maybe there's another detour we're taking first.
Yeah. And one thing that's before I begin like actually talking about the actual structure of this, right? It harkens back to the last week's discussion around scarcity centric economic design, and why is it that other popular blockchain providers don't do this, right? And it kind of all ties back to that concept. So when a developer is not able to correctly and efficiently predict the actual cost of what the infrastructure will be, there is no other options besides directly passing that to the end users, right? So, um, like for example, like with Netflix, if the reason why they're able to do this is as a business, as a product, they're able to predict essentially the cost of the infrastructure to a relatively accurate degree, so that they can price the actual revenue side correctly, right? And that's one side, is the predictability of it. But the second side also is that the cost of the actual infrastructure is directly proportional to how much I use, right? So not how much someone else uses the infrastructure, right? And so we talked about this before, where one of the big problems with um, a scarcity centric monolithic design is, um, let's say I'm Netflix and I'm using AWS, and AWS happens to set the price of their compute not based on how much I use, but based on how much everyone else uses. And let's say this week I'm the only one really using it, so it's pretty cheap. But next week, let's say Apple decides to launch a video of them crushing a whole bunch of instruments, and it kills the internet, and suddenly my AWS bill is 4 times it was before. Then it's very difficult as a business, as Netflix essentially, to be like, hey, what do you set your revenue to, right? What do you set, like, how much do you gather from the users to pay for that? And if you're not able to predict this in a predictable fashion, then your only solution ultimately is to offload this cost to the end user somehow directly. And this is kind of what has happened in Web3, right? Unfortunately, the gas cost of Ethereum and other monolithic chains is not dependent on me. Suddenly one day, some pump.fun, crazy meme coin can suddenly start clogging Solana's blockchain, and I have no control over how much like the infrastructure cost ultimately is. And so um, the reason why uh, um, most blockchain is unable to actually mimic this kind of economic structure is it kind of goes back to the conversation we had last week with scarcity centric design, and it kind of percolates all the way down to what we're talking about today. And so let's talk about how. Oh, sorry, I saw you unmute.
No, I was just gonna say like there's this. I don't mean to derail you or anything like that, but like as an aside, like for a bunch of you who are in here who are builders, I see our game builders in here. I see people who are validators. We have a bunch of longtime Saga stands that are part of this. You know that we have found early on success, and a lot of use cases have been gaming, and I think that we could pull that analog in here and make it really really clear, crystal clear. Because if you are a small um, indie developers making a game, and your game is just not is gonna you're not gonna have the amount of usership that a Call of Duty and or Fortnite is gonna have. And that's not a slight to you or anything along those lines. Gaming is amazing because there's simply different sized games, different shapes of them. Some of them are large and have massive usership. Some of them are super small, and they're single player, not multiplayer, and so they go through other things. If you were building on a system where let's say everybody had to use the same pipes, and you're a small indie developer, and sitting next to you is Fortnite, that has whatever 61 million, 50 million DAUs. Your costs are going to skyrocket if you have to use the same exact tubes as sitting next to what Fortnite's going to use. It's going to stifle a lot of the well, just like the opportunity that you have, because the cost is going to become so immense. So I think that this idea of um, are you paying for your use, how much you're using the pipes, or are you paying based off of how much everybody else is using it? And those costs are also affecting you. I don't know. Maybe I've gone off on a tangent
No, no,
now, but
no.
it feels like it
That's exactly
crystallizes
right.
very clear in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, imagine for example, like a good example would be like Steam. Like instead of Steam charging based on your like your revenue as a percentage, right? Imagine if they did a fixed cost model and you had to pay based on like which games people are playing. Like one day you're doing fine and then tomorrow like Baldur's Gate 3 launches and then like literally everyone downloads that and now your costs are like 10 times the amount that is normal. Like that doesn't happen in the real world. And there's a reason why Steam, Netflix, every single one of these providers have created economic flows that work this way because it is a much more sustainable model ultimately, and it allows you to grow and um, uh, uh, um, scale your operation much more efficiently. And we kind of talked about like why you want non-scarce economic design, and that really comes into it is like if you want to support or be able to sustain a large amount of scale, this is really the only way to start thinking about it because the builders will start essentially feeling like they can't really build on it, and this is kind of one of the primary reasons why it's been hard to convince mass users to come in, developers who want to promote mass uses to come into blockchain because of the fundamental way that the economic system has been formed. Yeah, it's a really good point. And so let me describe the two-tier token economic system. So just to summarize again, we've kind of talked about this very briefly, but the idea here is the developer of the application, the community, or maybe a DAO, whoever is maintaining essentially a chainlet, is paying for renting that chainlet from Saga, essentially. So the economic system flow is there is some commodity pricing that Saga charges for spinning up a chainlet. And as I said, the developer, the community, the DAO, whoever is maintaining that product is paying for the chainlet itself. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of users, end users of the chainlet, essentially, that are using the chainlet. Those are the customers of developer, community, DAO members, essentially, that product. They pay the developer, community, DAO just like directly, right? And the idea here is that the end users really do not interact directly with the infrastructure. There's no like notification saying, oh, there's a fee that goes to the infrastructure. None of that really is transparent to the end user, and it almost looks like the end user is just interacting directly with the product itself. And when we say we're a layer one to launch layer ones, this is kind of similar, right? So when you use a layer one, um, you just like, let's say you're using Solana, you just use Solana based on how Solana wants their token economic system to run. The Solana Foundation and the team and the like, maybe a DAO or the community have come together and decided that this is the best way for Solana to generate economic value and provide value to Solana stakers or Solana stakeholders. There's no like third party, another like bill that goes out to the user saying you must buy another ETH token somewhere to interact with Solana. That doesn't happen. So that's the benefit of like L1s in general compared to other blockchain systems. And so when we say we are a layer one to launch layer ones, we're replicating all of that. So when a developer essentially spins up a chainlet, it's them who have direct control over exactly how the economic system functions. So if whichever method they want to use to monetize or design in the economic system, we allow that to happen because we don't enforce any direct kind of payment from the end users back to the infrastructure or Saga itself. So just want to float that out there. Maybe if there was like another, I'll take a quick break and then we'll move into like, what does this enable? And there's some really cool stuff you can do and this is kind of more directly towards builders, but some folks will really enjoy kind of what kind of design this opens up that doesn't exist in blockchain today.
Yeah, I think it's, for those of us who've been in the space for quite a while, I think that maybe in maybe it was 21, maybe it was before. We started to see more and more different applications pop up and kind of talk a bit about like, oh, we're gasless, right? Like, oh, our protocol is gasless or our chain is gasless. And like for those who maybe now or have real knowledge of the space, you understand that in a proof of stake that's not really feasible, for actual like security of the network. And so at Saga, though there is gas, that is what we're going to 100% talk about. Jin's going to kind of take this next section and talk directly to you, the builders. We talk about this idea of abstraction, and we really genuinely, we are building a system that we truly want to take away a lot of the facade or just the extra steps that a normal everyday user of decentralized protocols has to go through. This idea that we abstract away the cost for infrastructure from the user is what is the best that we can do for the end user. I think the best stewardship of good experiences for people who are coming into this space. If we truly believe that we are going to see decentralized protocols expand and have billions of users in the future. I think that we're all here because we know that that is a point out there in the horizon. But the way that most systems sit today, there is no real hope that we can scale to that size without jumping through so many more hoops, without jumping through so many more bridges to so many more L2s, to so many more roll-ups, to so many more roll apps. This idea that you're just adding more steps to the user's process, somehow maybe abstracting away some of those costs, but ultimately you're applying the pressure to them where they have to do more in their wallet, or they have to figure out how to bridge funds in a different way. All of these things we just see as kind of, I don't know, they seem like trying to take shortcuts when really top to bottom, the actual structure of how we set up decentralized systems needs to change. And Saga is the way that we are taking an approach at creating a system that is truly non-scarce, that gives the developers of applications the tools that they need to scale. If you need block space, you can come to Saga and we create a L1 where you are not going to compete. If you are the indie game that is building, your chainlet will only have your transactions on it, and you will not have to worry about if next to you on the next chainlet is a game that has 100x the transactions. And if you are the big game, if you are the dream is to be the future of the next Fortnite or what it might be, we have the tools for you to be able to scale elastically, to spin up another chainlet and attach that as well, so that you will be able to scale as more users come in the door. And you'll never have to worry about affecting or creating more pipeline or congestion for the other players in the ecosystem. We're trying as best we can to kind of communicate, I think, the idea that we see a better and brighter future out there. And this is part of why all of us who have worked in the decentralized space for a long time, we have to seek out this innovation. We have to be able to not just experiment, because I think experiment is great, but actually throw the full weight behind a new model and a new idea of how we can grow this space to the usership that we need. I mean, ultimately, many of us here understand that a lot of what blockchains are going to be used for, things like decentralized finance, institutional work at a massive, massive level, like absolutely incredible amounts of transactions are going to be happening every single day on decentralized platforms. And today they are, but in the near future, that's going to go up by multiples. Are the systems that are set up today set up in a way that the single use case person, are they allowed to participate in this world on an even footing with these institutions and enterprise size systems? Or are those enterprise systems going to squeeze out and eventually suck up all of the block space that is available on these monolithic chains, and eventually create these volatile environments of gas and fees on the end user? We really believe that setting up a new tokenomic structure where like you said, the developer, the DAO, the community, whoever has actually spun up this chainlet, they can figure out if they want to monetize or how to monetize their user base. There's many ways that are established in Web3 today. There's many traditional ways of monetizing users that you can, we're seeing our builders start to experiment with a lot of ways to do that. But they don't have to worry about driving those those L1 chainlet management costs down to the end user. We want to protect the end user at the end of the day, so that they don't have to interact with something as uh, uh, something like the infrastructure that we're building on the back end. That should just be hidden from them. So again, I've kind of gone off a bit here, but I think, Jen, hopefully this is a little bit of a segue, I think, a bit into maybe talking more to the builders themselves. How can they take the most advantage of the system that we've set up? If we've kind of focused so far on abstraction away from end user, what should builders be thinking about as they build out their
Yeah,
chainlets?
yeah. And thanks for that. You've kind of started talking about, the gaslessness or potential costlessness of our system. And so, um, you know, monetization is not something that should be enforced by the infrastructure, and ultimately. So if you take a look at like Amazon Web Services, Amazon doesn't say whatever is hosted on those servers need to make some money, right? You can spin up a AWS instance for a pet project that is not ever intended to make money. It's, maybe you just like hosting your cat pictures on, Amazon Web Services to have access to 24/7. There's no, potential revenue, ever, but somebody may want to pay Amazon Web Services for the service of providing that infrastructure. And so, by allowing this kind of economic model, we talked about this last week a little bit. It allows for much more experimentation of potential chains that maybe is not designed to make money, but it is designed to do something interesting for the users. And so, kind of one thing that you mentioned that's really interesting is, as mentioned with the gaslessness, right? The your system is on like. Imagine, for example, if I was like a layer 2, right? And eventually I need to settle back on Ethereum. And we kind of previewed this last week, but if any one single part of your system is designed to be scarcity centric, then you kind of devolve your entire system back to a scarcity model. And um, uh, we talked about earlier today, one of the reasons why this happens is because the difficulty of creating a system in which I don't have to pass the actual infrastructure cost directly to the end user is only possible if I'm able to predict relatively easily what the cost of my infrastructure will be, right? And if you're like a layer 2, or if you're and you have a lot of random different costs associated with all these different blockchain systems, that gets harder and harder over time to predict the cost ultimately. And so that's one of the reasons why we have designed this entire system so that all of the components within the block production actually happens within Saga. And this is because of the economic design that we're trying to build is only possible by having this like vertically integrated slice that we control 100% of, so that we can design the economics of the entire process. And so that's like one thing. And so, yeah, jumping into more of the developer side of things, there are some really cool things you can do with this now. So like, for example, we talked about this. You can make, you don't have to even need to make any money for with this chain, because ultimately it's not a system in which you are forced to pay for infrastructure cost over time, right? So, you can essentially, exactly how much a monthly cost of keeping up your chain is, and you just need to make sure that whatever use case you get out of this is worth that much. You don't really have to worry about whether or not, including new transactions is going to cost, 20 times that. So it's not sustainable or not ultimately. So what can you do, right? So our chainlets have gas, right? There's a gas calculation that happens, and this is because you can't allow like mass spamming. If you set the gas to 0 in any chainlet or any chain, for example, one problem you kind of run into is what Solana ran into, which is you don't know which transactions should be included, and you start getting bombarded essentially with spam transactions, right? So gas is enabled within our chainlets. So in that one chainlet, exactly. There's a spam prevention mechanism essentially. The difference in Saga is that the gas doesn't go back to the validators or infrastructure providers or Saga. That gas like gets returned back to the developer's wallet essentially, right? So there's some really cool things you can do with that now that you've created this wallet essentially that the gas goes back into. So one thing you can do is you can create a layer one, like any other layer one that exists out there. We talked about this. You create, like I see stake CETO in there. So maybe you can make a CETO token be the gas token of your chainlet. Users use your CETO token and make transactions, and those CETO tokens go back into your wallet essentially. Because the front end essentially economic system is completely separate from the back end. So the back end is paid using Saga tokens. The front end is essentially can be in any token. It can be Saga if you wanted to. You can use USDC. You can make Ethereum. You can use a bridge token from another ecosystem, for example. So let's say I want to use Polygon as a gas token within my chainlet. That is entirely possible because, as mentioned, this gives the freedom for the developer, the DAO, the community to say, hey, we want to get paid in this other token instead of my own token or maybe Saga. Can that be possible? And in the past, the problem was you need to get your infrastructure provider like whitelisted with specific tokens and convince them that they need to take these tokens. But maybe, as a developer, I would like to have that determination and that method of essentially selecting a random token that I would like to get, right? And so support for kind of third-party tokens are completely possible once you split this economic system into two. As mentioned, we said that you can make a completely free chainlet, right? And so another thing you can technically do as well is instead of actually making a fee-based economic system, let's do what Netflix does. I would like to do a subscription-based access to chains, right? So the idea here is my revenue model might not be tied to the transaction of the chain at all, right? So maybe somebody just pays me a monthly fee of like $30, and I give them access to my the chainlet essentially, and they can kind of decide how much they want to use, and we can rate limit that. And finally, what I want to talk about, which is really exciting, is we have this concept called recycled gas tokens. And I think we have a blog post actually about this. So imagine we talked about the stake CETO token, the CETO token on the chainlet example. When let's say this CETO token is not trading anywhere, is literally just a token that is used to pay for gas on the stake CETO chainlet, right? If let's say I give Micah here one stake CETO token for him to interact with the chain essentially, then and it costs one CETO token to run a transaction on that chain. I can kind of set that as a developer, right? Then essentially what happens is Micah gets to have one transaction. He runs that transaction and interacts with the chain. That CETO token goes from Micah to the stake CETO team who has the stake CETO chainlet. And you essentially have just given access to somebody to interact with a chain and receive that access token back. And so if you're familiar with like how API keys work in traditional businesses, in Web2 businesses, this is very similar, right? So generally what will happen is, let's say you pay like Cloudflare or some technology company $10, and what they say is, oh, we'll give you access to 10,000 access to our platform essentially, and you can kind of rate limit how much someone can use. You can design something similar with these CETO tokens now. So let's say I know that somebody has paid me $20, and the contract says it will give them access to 10,000 transactions on the chain. What I can do is every month I can give somebody 10,000 tokens, and I know that by the end of the month, if they need more, they'll need to pay for more of that essentially. And the nice thing about this is, as mentioned, whenever someone uses those API tokens on the chain, it comes back to me. So there's actually no cost to the developer ultimately. And so we have this concept called recycled gas tokens. It allows somebody to essentially give access to chain resources without worrying about revenue directly. You can essentially almost create a gasless experience where, in fact, there's like in that article, it actually builds out a really interesting example where the user doesn't even know that the tokens are getting fauceted as API keys, because what ends up happening is, let's say they have a front end, and in the front end, the user of that chainlet, for example, requests a transaction. There can be a faucet essentially that faucets that token to that user's wallet automatically just in time, and then that token amount is used as gas to include in the transaction, and then that token comes directly back to the faucet essentially. And so you can have these really interesting interaction flows where the faucet code then now decides, oh, this person is whitelisted to interact with my chain, and so I can give them access to these API tokens, and it's a completely free way for someone to interact with the chain essentially without worrying about whether or not they've purchased tokens or not. So there's some really interesting innovation that comes from this two-tier economic structure. That, you know, this is just like the very beginning of what's possible. There's like so many more complicated things you can do once you kind of bifurcate this like revenue driving factor from the infrastructure cost ultimately. And so I know this was like a little bit convoluted kind of towards the end, but I just wanted to summarize some of these use cases that are really interesting.
I think it's awesome, and obviously you're very passionate about it. I can't wait for you to get off this call and hear about one of the innovators that's already starting to use recycled gas tokens, because I got to try out their app earlier today in the testnet phase, and it's crazy. It's actually like wild to just go through this experience and get the token distributed to you, pay it back to them, and not really have to think about anything else.
Yeah, and like it's like this cuts away the UX issue of like, you don't need to go and buy like a token on a deck somewhere. This is like disgusting, right? So like this is such a better way of designing the whole system where the application owner essentially can gatekeep who gets tokens and how much, and then controls that flow ultimately. I think this is really cool, especially in gaming as well, right? Like it's super easy for game developers to be like, hey, go log in using your email and your account, and once you do that, you can kind of like interact with the chain as many times as you want, and you don't have to worry about gas tokens. It's like something that's a value proposition that is really, really exciting for me. So